Hello and welcome to our fourth and final instalment for the Cellar Sessions podcast release on Mendoza. I am your co-host Anna Spooner.
And Alexandre Fréguin, and today we're gonna go touching the sky with the incredible vineyard located in altitude. Altitude is a word that makes music to my ears. Over the past few months, I've been traveling to many places in France, outside of France. I did a few and quite a lot of wine fair. To be honest, I did all the wine fair possible. And I've been tasting a lot of wine. I've attended many master classes. And it came up that there is a word which being pronounced probably thousands of times a day, which is altitude, which is fine. And the shortcut is quite often taken to we are making wines in altitude and we're going to have some fresher style, which it makes music that I can listen to that song. I can listen to the full album, but I want to know if somebody can define me what is altitude legally. And you know how much I have a strong interest into legal stuff.
Oh.
So can you define that,
Always
please?
for the legal stuff, Alex. So there is a legal definition. So the CERVIM, which the Servim, I don't know what, but it translates as the European Centre for Research, Environmental Sustainability and Mountain Viticulture. And they define altitude as over 500 meters above sea level.
All right. Good. I have a definition.
Okay. So, well, what's your definition?
That makes sense. We will see that. I think altitude is a parameter to be taken in consideration within the topography.
Okay.
And other elements have to be combined with altitude. It's not just you go higher, you will have fresher style of wine, or at least it's quite often also related to quality, which I am feeling a little bit angry at that, which means that everybody producing wine, there is the mountain wines and the valley floor. It's not, to me, it just doesn't sound right. Altitude for me is when it has an effect on the finished wine.
Okay.
That's what I mean. It could affect many parts, and we will see that. But I think we need to have also a clear definition of when to use that word and not using it anywhere.
So for your mind, places like, and I'm going to go Europe now because I think we probably both agree Europe is more limited when we think about altitude. So regions like the Savoie or Valle d'Aosta in Italy, are they mountainous wines or are they altitude wines?
I've used the word in a previous episode of Alpine.
Mm-hmm.
I will probably say that Valle d'Aosta has a clear influence. When you go to Blanc de Morges, Saint-La-Salle, and you're at 800, you are at 1,000 meters of altitude. If we take a quick data on that, every 100 meters, you will have an influence on the air temperature. And this, on a 1,000 scale, I will say so.
It matters.
It matters.
Yeah.
In Europe, but also I find it challenging for the consumer or even for the wine professional. And we all like, the fun fact, or we all like the smallest vineyard, the largest vineyard, the higher up. If you want to have fun, Google highest altitude, highest vineyard in terms of altitude, and you will see the results. Nobody can agree.
Find it. Yeah.
I had on the first page 5 different locations. From Calabria, passing by Valle d'Aosta, going to El Hierro in Tenerife, and in La Habana, and giving me example of the Etna, with the declassified part of the Etna. And thanks God, we will do a full podcast on Etna.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit challenging that altitude question.
So they're the highest vineyards in Europe, just to be clear, right? Not in the world. Because
No,
in the world, we then start to
now we're
see,
talking.
when we move out of Europe, we start to see some serious stuff going down, right? So obviously, Mendoza, the reason we're doing this podcast in the
Yes.
Mendoza series, Mendoza goes up to like 2,000 meters above sea level.
Do you want a fun fact?
Yeah, hit me.
A few years ago, I was judging a sommelier competition, and into my hands, I got given the theory. I was not on the theory panel, but they gave me the theory, and I was helping to correct. And one of the questions was like, "What's the highest vineyard in the world?" And I looked at it, and the correct answer was Bodega Colomé
In
and the
Salta.
cuvée in Salta in Argentina with the Altura Maxima. And I'm like, well, I don't want to sound bad, but when was the last time the questionnaire was updated?
Mm-hmm.
And I got told a few years ago, I'm like, well, you need to check Tibet now.
Yeah, for sure.
And, and it was funny in a way that it's like we are looking at who's going to be entering first or updating the Guinness World Record book.
It's the race to the top, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the one you've mentioned, Colomé and Salta, that was for many years considered top, right? They couldn't even ripen Cabernet Sauvignon up there. It was too cold. And then Tibet, I think, is 3,000 and something. They've got
3,553, if I'm not wrong.
yeah, and it's basically in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
But they're making Bordeaux blends up there.
Yeah.
So interesting, because what you did just mention about is, you've got to add altitude in with other variables. The wine, the wine being made in Tibet is a Bordeaux blend based on Cabernet Sauvignon, and in Salta they couldn't ripen their Cabernet Sauvignon. So we're not. It's very interesting as well. I think when you talk about altitude, you can't possibly just compare
No.
one thing and the other. There's
Oh.
loads of variables, loads of variables. But okay, so we've talked about what altitude is, or we've tried to define it.
Right.
We've tried. We touched on a really good point earlier, which was, why does it matter? You think about altitude as in altitude is a point at which it matters.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
You know I want to ask you this because that's something that I really want your point of view on this.
Yeah.
You, an entrepreneur, wine professional, do you care about altitude when you buy some wine or when you got recommended some wine? Is it a matter of fact that altitude is going to be like, you're going to someone's place and you'll be like, I brought you a wine from Altitude Vineyard?
No, I wouldn't. I would not, or I wouldn't send my husband out on the shopping list and say, can we get some high altitude wines for dinner? I think it can be an interesting way to group wines together. If I opened a wine list and there was a section on high altitude wines, I might be like, oh, that sommelier is trying to do something interesting. But it wouldn't necessarily be the reason I'm buying the wine. I think it can act as more of an interesting concept. I think that there are other reasons I would buy a wine way before how high is it off the ground? How high is it above the sea? What's your answer to that question?
We discussed it in private, and it's something that, in terms of consideration, I like to attach that to heroic viticulture.
Mm-hmm.
Quite often, altitude brings challenges, and I mean, in the vineyard, even for the workers. But it brings also challenges to the vine itself.
For sure.
We should not forget that lovely plant that is interacting like human being. But I agree with you. I will be like, oh, if wines are classified like that, I will not go crazy just classifying by levels of altitude, but having an alpine or heroic viticulture or high altitude vineyard, because we realize that it depends also, you need to have the right grape grown there.
Mm-hmm.
The cultivar is very, very important. I will take a quick example on that because you have grape variety, like, for example, in high altitude, like Glera.
Mm-hmm.
that we don't consider much rather than being 85% of any Prosecco. Glera is an extremely good grape variety for high altitude viticulture and accumulation of what we will call the polyphenol. Rather than Cabernet Sauvignon, uh, altitude will have an incredible effect on its aromatic profile, but it has a downside to the thickness of the tannins. Because the Cabernet Sauvignon will behave in a way that it's not accumulating in the skin, the seeds, and the pips the same way than other grapes. But it has a good side of it because higher you go with the lower air temperature, higher pyrrazine you will get. Rather
Okay.
than valley floor, you will get more red fruit driven. So it's not one single thing, but we can get into that if you want now.
Let's do that. Let's get into it, and together let's work through why on earth should we even care? So how does altitude affect the grape growing and therefore the finished wines?
In the end, what matters is quality. That's what matters. Singularity and quality. But with a well-established study on what to plant, where to plant, and how to cultivate. We need to take in consideration in altitude the air temperature, the water supply, the airflow, of course, the steepness, and one thing, which is the UV. Not forget about that because it's super important.
Okay.
And of course, but we could do a full podcast on that, the soil composition, because it's always part of everything. But when you're at 1,000 or you're at 3,000, not the same nutrient supply, not the same type of soil. In this case, we need to consider that there is less water, so more drainage. So there is all of this. And we're putting the vine into a higher, sometimes stress situation, but not always. So that's the element I will take. And probably link up to this. What is important too is the cultivar.
Yeah.
Which grape am I going to put higher? Which grape I'm going to put lower? So that's the element I will take in consideration. Then what's the effect on the finished wine? The first part I would like to discuss is what we talked about, the phenolics. So the phenol, all the non-liquid related part of the grape will behave differently. Fun fact, if you take the Syrah, for example, it will have a different evolution in terms of growth of the pips, seeds, and skin. The pips and the seeds tends to go lower, and the skin tends to get thicker.
So in Syrah, at high altitude, you get thicker skins on Syrah because of solar radiation?
That's
or
basically the way
they
that the
think?
grape behaves, the DNA of the grape and the importance of the cultivar.
So you're getting thicker skins, but you're getting less pips, seeds.
Yes, so you will
Okay.
have, of course, an influence on your finished tannins.
Okay.
As I've mentioned also previously in a previous podcast, also the aromatic compounds of the example Syrah and the Rotundon will increase at a certain altitude and will decrease at some others. But you need to consider the water supply. Wetter it goes, higher Rotundon it is. It's been wonderful studies being made actually in the entire world that it happens that Auvergne, wet as possible, was where you end up with a higher level of Rotundon also in Gamay.
Okay,
So
interesting.
this is linked up to another parameter. But that's for the let's call it the phenolic part in a way. A bit of data, and if you take altitude, every 100 meters, your air temperature will decrease from 0.65 degrees to 1 degree. So imagine on 1,000 meters, and when you are above 500 meters,
It's exponentially.
it's exponential.
Yeah.
So you end up, I'm thinking about an appellation like Etna. You can have 25 degrees difference.
From top to bottom of the mountain.
It's impressive. Just imagine in Mendoza 12 degrees different day and night. It's
Yeah.
highly intense.
And that's where the cultivar comes in
That's
hugely importantly, though, right? Because you're talking about how whether you can actually grow a grape that will survive in that temperature.
completely. That's as I said, the effect on the tannins. We did studies on glera. There is studies also on Exicara, which is another grape variety.
And the Catena Institute has bringing it back to Mendoza and Malbec. I mean, they specialize in UV radiation in Malbec.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. And another data, UV radiation is increasing of 10% every 1,000 meters.
Okay.
So it's pretty big. Your vegetation, like your green part, is slowing of 1 day every 30 meters.
So let me see if I've got this right. Every 30 meters you go up,
Yes,
you're
you get 1 day delay in your cycle.
in your cycle.
But this
Interesting.
is
Okay.
one parameter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you have weather condition, it's
You
an
can't take it
interesting
in
thing.
isolation, right? Yeah.
Another thing that is important to me, we talk about freshness. I agree it's cooler, and it's well proven that you will have some natural acidity being retained. However, the skin will grow thicker, and every analysis on many high altitude cultivar are showing that wines have higher tannins concentration in any cases. So that's a fact that I like the idea of freshness, but it's a climatic freshness. So it's not just the structure are more firm.
Mm.
It-
I think that's a good point to make because okay, so let's go back to my analogy of opening your wine list in a restaurant and
yes.
seeing high altitude vineyards. Don't expect it all to be kind of light. You're not necessarily going to be drinking a light red wine.
No.
At a high altitude, a Malbec is going to be powerful. It's going to be high everything. It's like turning the volume up on every speaker in the house. It's not stylistically freshness doesn't equal lightness when you're growing at altitude.
The effect of altitude, most part of the literature will report what we just said. But if we look at it, it also has an incredible level on the color of the wine.
Mm-hmm.
Grapevines that are cultivated in vineyards with low temperature, they have always a higher potential of containing color and volatile compound. That's studies conclude by Gutierrez in 2018 that are spectacular. And you end up with deep, dark, concentrated style. Also, your liquid and solid ratio is lower sometimes. So that will, of course, concentrate that. But your acidity is decrease way slower.
Yeah.
So that's things to be considered in the end. And as I say, there is the UV things, which for me is a very important thing because UV is good, but it can be also damaging. And the smart plant that I always mention at higher altitude will increase some antioxidant component. One of them is very well known because it's used in many cream and just to look young and fresh all of our life. But it also helps in a way that the plant naturally develops some sort of sunscreen effect against UV. So this is to be taken in consideration into the final wine.
So we've talked about the temperature generally reducing. We've talked about the fact, so that will affect which grapes you can grow, potentially preserve some acidity in the wine. Not to mean that it's light, but that there will be some climatic freshness. We've talked about diurnal range. Same again. You slow your ripening down, so you slow your degradation of your acids, and you potentially slow the character of the fruit, so you're not getting as much of like an overtly fruity flavor potentially with your greater diurnal range. We've talked about solar radiation and the UV effect on particularly the outside of the skins, but generally the UV effect
Mhm.
on the plant. We've touched on soils. It's a tricky one. We can't battle it in this session. It's not enough. But soil variation at altitude is significant, right?
Com-
Because of the formation of the altitude. You know, the mountain that you're growing your grapes on are going to have totally different soil compositions.
the soil is always a thing, and we will consider a big podcast on that. But soil is the matrix, but soil is about nutrient exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And nutrient exchange is what will have a direct influence on the viticulture and the development of the plants, between all those nutrients, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and all of this. And of course, highly poor, free draining soil from top altitude to lower ones. But this is a spectrum which is going for me horizontally rather
Okay.
than going vertically, because it's really depending. We will add an element into the discussion which makes it too unique to every single site.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
You can't compare like for like on the altitude front when you're comparing a volcanic mountain and, you know, the nutrient makeup of volcanic soils versus the nutrient makeup of a limestone plateau.
completely,
They're not the
completely.
same.
And it's also, as I was telling about the color, I also we have tools which are interesting to use, and we'll open a discussion just a bit after. But the Cool Night Index,
Yeah.
which is combined with the GST, so it's the growing season temperature. These two have also two very strong elements to calculate the effect on altitude versus the plant.
Okay. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
They calculated in numbers, and if we look at the future, they are calculated in degrees, and the CNI is meant to increase from 6 points, and the GST is supposed to increase from 4 to 7 points. It's huge. We're talking points of temperature.
Okay. I need to look into that. You've given me something to research, Alex. I'm intrigued. Um, okay. So we've discussed what the actual effect is on the vineyard. We haven't really talked about ventilation. I suppose that comes a bit into your heroic viticulture. You know, winds. It might change the way you have to grow. I'm thinking of like Canary Islands now. You know, you might change the way you have to grow the vine itself. But other than that, I think we've really well covered how it affects vineyards and how it affects the final wine.
Yeah, it's it's, and as I said, every grape variety will act differently. There is one more thing that we haven't covered it, but very briefly, the vigor of the vine is way different. It doesn't mean that higher you go, less vigorous it is. But if you imagine that you have more vigor, in the end, you will preserve more acidity rather than concentrating. And
Okay.
that's an element related to the viticulture and the heroic viticulture, in a way that there is also the density of planting, which is super, super important.
Okay.
And quite
So
often in those sites, you don't plant a 100 hectares single plot.
okay.
So that's one other element to take in consideration.
And we're going to do an episode on heroic viticulture, I think, in the next month, so we can we can cover that more extensively. I think because it's a whole other way of growing grapes, right? The actual viticulture, the
And
actual human intervention of producing wine at this.
if I can just say one more thing, I call this the Bolivian example. And it's been a lot of studies and experiment made in this country, like many other countries. But they experimented between 1,600 meters and 2,300 meters of altitude, grape variety that you will never think could grow in the same environment: Tanat
Okay.
and Grenache
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and Carignan.
Okay.
And what's coming up with all of this and Sangiovese
Why
and
not?
altitude, it's very important. It's the maturation. And all these grape variety, which are submitted to long maturation period
Hmm.
and late level of maturity, we can add Tempranillo into that study.
Yeah.
They all shown that they behaved way better in those environments compared to Pinot, Cabernet, and other grape variety from this family. Long grain, which makes sense because everything is delayed with this altitude range and elevation. And that shows, once again, that they are interesting perspective for after, but they also are element of research for nursery and grape breeding. It doesn't mean that warm grape variety coming from warm climate will suit obviously some certain region or will be the right solution for vine growing in the nearer future.
Okay.
But going in altitude is not either always the solution into the evolution of the climate.
And that's a good place to finish. I think, yes, it's often twinned, isn't it? We mentioned it at the beginning, the race to the top. Everyone's trying to get cooler and fresher styles of wine, but that maybe it's not just about altitude, it's about altitude and.
Altitude and we didn't mention also the latitude. Malbec is a thing, but when you are playing at 31 to 33, the range for viticulture is from 30 to 50 degrees. I mean, there is many things. But looking at cooler sites
However that
that
whatever that
perform,
is, yeah.
altitude and elevation combined with orientation is a thing. That's a thing.
That's the point. It can't just be altitude. It's
And
altitude or
and
altitude or.
and the plant also with altitude will struggle in some way also with the oxygen supply. So
Okay.
that's a give and take kind of situation.
There we go. So I think we've covered off everything we could think of to do with altitude there. If you are a sommelier with a wine list that focuses on altitude wines, let me know. I want to read it. But there are plenty of places in the world. I haven't tried a Tibetan wine yet. Maybe that needs to be our next endeavor, Alex. Will you find me a Tibetan wine that we can go and try?
I'm pretty sure. I was reading also an article about very interesting altitude wines in Bhutan,
Okay.
the Bhutan Wines Company.
I met him
Yes.
at Wine Paris. He's a cool guy. Yeah, we'll get his wines.
So yes, you pay.
Sounds good. All right. Well, until next session when we are going to be focusing on Etna.
Apparently, so talking about altitude, one more thing, and
Yes.
opening up as one of the treasure vineyard and viticulture in the entire Europe, I would say so.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.